There are moments in history when the veil between the ordinary and the unimaginable is torn, revealing the darkest corners of the human soul. These are the stories that haunt the minds of those who dare to uncover their truths. They are the tales that linger long after the headlines fade, leaving only unsettling questions in their wake. In the quietest corners of the world, in small towns and forgotten alleys, there are crimes that defy explanation, murders that seem senseless, unsolvable, and as cold as the night air that carries them into the history books. These are the stories that scream from the past, their mysteries unresolved, their killers slipping through the cracks of time. Each one, a puzzle with missing pieces, a terror with no easy answer. As you read, know that the horrors contained in these stories are not just confined to the pages. They linger, silent and waiting, in the places where these tragedies occurred. The towns that once echoed with the sounds of life now only whisper of the lives that were violently stolen away. The shadows of the past stretch long, casting an unsettling presence on the present. Prepare to journey into the heart of darkness, where innocence meets violence and the truth is buried beneath layers of fear and confusion. From the isolated farms of Europe to the streets of quiet American towns, these are the murder mysteries that refuse to die, stories of death, deception, and dread that continue to intrigue, torment, and fascinate. The questions remain unanswered. Who were the killers? Why did they strike? And what drove them to commit these unspeakable acts? Step into the unknown, where answers are few and horror lingers in every corner. The Devil in the Walls, the murder of the Bender family, 1870s. The wind howled relentlessly across the flat, desolate plains of Kansas, as if warning anyone who dared to cross its path. The land was unforgiving, a barren stretch of earth where hope seemed like an illusion. For most, it was the land of forgotten dreams, a harsh place where survival was a constant battle. Yet for the Bender family, it was a place they called home, a home that would become the setting for an unimaginable nightmare. The Benders, John and Elvira, along with their daughter Kate, settled in a small, weather-beaten cabin near the Osage Trail in the early 1870s. They were not the traditional pioneers people might expect, and their arrival was met with the quiet skepticism of the locals. John was a hulking figure, a man with the look of a farmer, but an unsettling presence. Elvira, his wife, was older, her eyes filled with secrets she would never speak. Kate, their daughter, was young and striking, her beauty alluring and enigmatic, though she often seemed detached from the world around her. The Benders ran a modest inn where they offered travelers food and shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw people in from the wilderness, weary from their travels, seeking warmth and safety. The cabin was a modest wooden structure, built haphazardly, with a large room where the family served meals to guests. There was something unsettling about the place, a disquiet in the air that lingered like the chill of an unspoken dread. As the months passed, reports began to surface of missing travelers along the Osage Trail. Men and women, some with families, had come to the Benders' Inn for rest, only to disappear without a trace. At first, it was written off as the dangers of the wild frontier, bandits, wolves, or perhaps the unforgiving nature of the land itself. But the disappearances didn't stop. They grew more frequent. It was a letter from a man named William McRae that finally prompted a full investigation. He had been traveling with his brother Isaac, and neither of them returned after staying at the Bender Inn. Sheriff Larrabee, a no-nonsense lawman with years of experience, set out with a few deputies to investigate the Benders. The locals had begun to whisper, the rumors festering like an open wound. Upon arriving at the Bender homestead, Sheriff Larrabee and his deputies were struck by the silence. The cabin appeared abandoned, as if the family had left in a hurry. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a metallic odor that clung to the walls. It was strange. There were no signs of a hasty departure, no belongings scattered about. The place seemed perfectly intact, save for the oppressive feeling that hung in the air. The sheriff's eyes narrowed when he noticed the trapdoor in the floor, hidden beneath a rug in the center of the room. He had been around long enough to know that nothing was ever as it seemed. With a sense of foreboding, he reached for the handle and slowly lifted the trapdoor, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that led down into the bowels of the earth. The deputies followed him down into the cellar, their boots creaking on the wooden steps as they descended into the suffocating darkness. The room below was cold, damp, and unnervingly still. The walls were lined with shelves of food and old farming tools, but something else was there, something far darker. The sheriff's heart skipped a beat as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The floor was littered with bloodstains, some fresh, some old, and it seemed to coat the walls, too, as if it had seeped into the very fabric of the earth. And then they saw it. The bodies. Dozens of them. Men, women, and children, their faces contorted in a final expression of terror. The bodies had been discarded in piles, some barely recognizable, their skin mutilated, their clothes torn. The horror was indescribable. The brutality of the murders was clear. Each victim had been killed in a violent, savage manner. Bludgeoned with a hammer, their skulls crushed, their bodies left to rot. The smell of death and decay permeated the cellar like a toxic fog, choking the air from the sheriff's lungs. The investigation quickly unraveled the chilling truth. The Bender family had been systematically murdering travelers for years. They had perfected the art of luring their victims into the house, offering them food and shelter, before executing them with brutal efficiency. John, with his immense strength, would strike the victim with a hammer, crushing their skull. Elvira would then assist in disposing of the body, stripping it of clothing, and preparing it for burial. Kate, the daughter, played a more disturbing role in the killings. She would seduce the victims before the fatal blow, her charm and beauty concealing the horrors that awaited. The Benders had been hunting humans, but the most chilling part of the story was the fact that they took pleasure in it. They had no remorse, no fear, no sense of guilt. To them it was a game, a twisted ritual that provided them with power, control, and a perverse thrill. But when the sheriff and his deputies arrived at the cabin to arrest them, the Benders had vanished. It was as if they had evaporated into thin air. Their belongings were gone, the food still simmering in pots on the stove, the fire still burning in the hearth. The only thing left behind was the blood that stained the walls, the blood that marked their crime. There were no footprints leading away from the cabin, no trace of where they had gone. The sheriff's investigation turned into a manhunt, but it was to no avail. The Benders were never found. Some believe they fled to the wilds of the West. Others think they were caught and executed by an angry mob. But no one ever discovered their fate. They became ghosts, legends that haunted the people of Kansas, their names whispered in fear and revulsion. The Bender cabin was abandoned, eventually falling into ruin. It was torn down years later, but the land itself never forgot. Visitors to the area still speak of the eerie presence that lingers in the air, the feeling of being watched. Some even claim to have heard strange noises at night, the sounds of footsteps echoing in the distance, the faint cry of a man or woman begging for mercy. To this day, the Bender family remains one of the most infamous and terrifying mysteries in American history. Their brutal final moments are a reminder that evil can hide in the most unsuspecting of places, even behind a smiling face and a warm hearth. The Black Dahlia. A Murder That Haunts Hollywood, 1947. In the heart of Hollywood, where dreams were made and broken under the harsh, unforgiving lights of fame, there was a darkness that no one ever truly saw. The city, known for its glitz, glamour, and the stars that adorned its sidewalks, was also a place where secrets could be buried beneath the weight of its dazzling illusions. But sometimes the darkness would rise to the surface, and when it did, it left a scar that could never be erased. Elizabeth Short, a young woman with dreams of stardom, found herself drawn to the bright lights of Hollywood in the early 1940s. She was only in her early 20s, but she had already gained a reputation for her beauty, a striking, almost ethereal quality that captivated anyone who looked at her. With her raven-black hair, pale skin, and wide, innocent eyes, she seemed to embody the very essence of classic Hollywood. But despite her allure, Elizabeth's dreams of becoming an actress remained unfulfilled. She struggled to break into the world of film, doing bit parts and working as a waitress to make ends meet. The Los Angeles she had come to live in wasn't the glamorous paradise she had imagined. It was a city full of empty promises, a place where only the most ruthless survived, and where beauty often came at a terrible price. Her life, though turbulent and filled with disappointment, was far from ordinary. Elizabeth, known to her friends as Betty, had a complicated romantic life. She was known to date men who were often older, wealthier, and in some cases, married. These relationships seemed to give her fleeting moments of hope, but the happiness they brought was always short-lived. She found herself drifting from man to man, from one relationship to another, her search for love and stability, continuing as she struggled to navigate the harsh realities of the Hollywood underworld. But it was a fateful night in January 1947 that would bring Elizabeth's story to an abrupt and horrific end, a night that would forever haunt Hollywood and leave a legacy of mystery that remains unsolved to this day. On the morning of January 15, 1947, the body of Elizabeth Short was discovered in a vacant lot on the outskirts of Leimert Park, a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles. Her body was mutilated in the most brutal and grotesque manner imaginable. She had been cut in half at the waist, her body drained of blood, and her face slashed from ear to ear into a grotesque smile. The brutality of the murder was chilling, and the discovery sent shockwaves through the city. The police, called to the scene, were immediately struck by the sheer horror of what they had found. Elizabeth's body was displayed with a cold, calculated precision, as if the killer had taken great care in arranging her in a way that would shock and horrify anyone who laid eyes on her. The blood that had drained from her body had pooled beneath her, staining the ground a dark, sickly red. Her mouth, twisted into a smile, seemed to mock the horror of her final moments. But what made the case even more disturbing was the complete absence of any witnesses or clues. Elizabeth's body had been left in the open, yet no one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The police were baffled, and the investigation quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in the history of Los Angeles. The press, as it always does with such gruesome events, quickly descended upon the case, eager for any scrap of information that might shed light on the identity of the killer. They dubbed the murder the Black Dahlia, a name that would come to symbolize one of the most haunting and infamous unsolved crimes in American history. The media frenzy surrounding the case was unlike anything the city had ever seen, with reporters and photographers scrambling for a glimpse of the victim and any hint of the truth behind the murder. But as the weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. Despite exhaustive investigations, the police were no closer to finding Elizabeth's killer. They followed countless leads, interviewed dozens of potential suspects, and pieced together fragments of Elizabeth's life. But every trail ended in a dead end. Some suspected it was a crime of passion, while others believed it was the work of a deranged serial killer. A handful of theories even suggested that Elizabeth's death was a form of twisted art, as though the killer had been inspired by the grotesque nature of the crime. The most disturbing element of the case was the eerie silence that seemed to follow Elizabeth's death. There were no apparent motives, no signs of struggle, and no clues as to why she had been targeted. It was as if she had been chosen at random, and her brutal end was the culmination of a much darker plan. In the days following her murder, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed that Elizabeth had been involved with powerful men in Hollywood, perhaps even a married man who had been desperate to keep their affair a secret. Others believed she had crossed paths with a dangerous individual who had fixated on her, someone who had become obsessed with her beauty and innocence. The most chilling rumor, however, was the idea that Elizabeth had been the victim of a twisted love triangle, where jealousy and obsession had driven someone to commit the unspeakable. In the wake of her death, several men came forward, claiming to have been romantically involved with her. But each of these men had an alibi, and none could be definitively tied to the crime. The investigation into Elizabeth's murder seemed to grow increasingly disjointed. Detectives found themselves chasing after false leads, each one more bizarre than the last. One of the most notable suspects was a man named George Hodel, a doctor with a dark past who had been linked to a number of mysterious deaths. He was never formally charged with Elizabeth's murder, but the theories surrounding his involvement persisted for years. Some believed he had been the killer, while others thought he was merely a red herring in a much larger, more sinister conspiracy. The case became a symbol of the darkness lurking beneath Hollywood's surface, a reminder that even in a world built on dreams, the most terrifying monsters can hide in plain sight. As the years passed, the Black Dahlia case became one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in the world. The murder of Elizabeth Short, whose beauty had once captivated the hearts of those around her, remained an open wound in the City of Angels. Her death was never fully explained. No one knew the identity of her killer, nor why they had chosen her. Some said that the truth would never be known, that the mystery would remain a part of the city's haunted past. But as time passed, the legend of the Black Dahlia continued to grow, a grim symbol of the dark forces that can twist even the most innocent of lives. And in the quiet corners of Hollywood, where the ghosts of old movies still linger in the shadows, Elizabeth Short's name is whispered as one of the city's most tragic and enigmatic figures. Her brutal final moments a haunting reminder that sometimes the brightest stars burn out the fastest, and in the most terrifying ways imaginable. The Hinterkaifeck Murders, A Family's Last Horrifying Moments, 1922. The wind was unrelenting on that cold, gray evening in March of 1922. It swept across the darkened fields of Bavaria, howling through the trees as if mourning the lives soon to be lost. The Hinterkaifeck farm, nestled deep in the rural woods of southern Germany, was as isolated as any place could be. The farm was not just remote. It was distant in the way that time seemed to move slower, and the land seemed to harbor something darker than the world outside. But on that night, the shadows that gathered there would take on a new, terrifying form. The Gruber family, living on the Hinterkaifeck farm, had no idea that their final night together would descend into horror. The family consisted of 6 members: Andreas Gruber, the father, a gruff and stoic man in his 60s, his wife, Cecilia, their daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children, Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and Joseph. There was also a maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only recently joined the family. The farm had long been a place of hard labor, yet the family had grown accustomed to its isolation. What they didn't know was that something had been creeping through their home for weeks, someone or something that would soon end their lives. The first strange incident occurred a week before the murders. Andreas Gruber had discovered strange footprints leading to his home from the forest. They were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone coming or going after. Disturbed by this, Andreas told his family about it, but they dismissed it as the work of animals or perhaps someone from the nearby village playing tricks. However, it was clear that the eerie feeling in the air was growing stronger. A sense of dread, palpable and suffocating, had begun to settle over the farm. Then, a few days before the murders, Andreas reported hearing noises coming from the attic. A strange scraping sound that seemed like someone was moving around up there. He assumed it was just a rodent or perhaps the wind, but when the noises continued, he went up into the attic to investigate. To his shock, he found nothing, just the usual dust and old belongings. The unsettling feeling only deepened. Someone, or something, was hiding on the farm, and they had been there for days. The maid, Maria, who had only recently joined the household, was particularly unnerved by the strange events. She told villagers that she had seen shadowy figures in the windows at night, but when she went to investigate, the house appeared empty. She was terrified, but her warnings went largely ignored. The family assumed that Maria, a young woman unused to the isolation of the farm, was simply frightened by the vast wilderness surrounding them. But the unease was growing. The strange noises, the mysterious footprints, and the sense of being watched all pointed to something more sinister. And then, on the night of March 31st, 1922, everything changed. The family was preparing for bed when the unseen terror finally revealed itself. Whoever had been lurking in the shadows of the farm had moved in for the kill. It began with the murder of Andreas Gruber himself. The killer, or killers, used a heavy implement, a pickaxe perhaps, and struck Andreas in the head. The force of the blow left him dead instantly. His body slumped onto the floor in a pool of blood. The killer then moved through the house methodically, as if they knew the layout, as if they had been living there for days, observing the family. Cecilia, Andreas's wife, was next. She was also bludgeoned to death, her skull crushed in a single brutal strike. But it wasn't just the elderly couple who fell victim to the killer's wrath. Victoria, their daughter, was murdered too, her throat slashed with such violence that she too died in moments. The two children, Cecilia and Joseph, were not spared either. The killer stalked them with chilling precision, the young ones unaware of the fate awaiting them. The children were struck with the same merciless force, their small bodies left lifeless in their beds. But the horror didn't stop there. In a display of calculated cruelty, the killer went upstairs to the attic, where Maria Baumgartner had been staying. Maria, who had been trying to escape the terror of the house, was found in her room and murdered too. It seemed as if there was no escape from the horror, no way to hide or run. When the killers had finished their grisly work, they made no attempt to flee the scene. Instead, they remained in the house for several days. In fact, it was believed that the killer, or killers, actually stayed in the attic for a period of time following the murders. The family's food was consumed, and the bodies were left lying in their final resting places, untouched, as if the killers were relishing in the aftermath of their savagery. After several days of silence, neighbors became concerned when no one from the farm appeared to come to town. They sent a search party, which included a local policeman, to investigate. Upon arriving at the farm, they discovered the horror that had unfolded within. The bodies of the Gruber family and the maid were found in various states of decay, their lives stolen with brutal, methodical violence. The police were horrified and quickly began their investigation, but the case grew more perplexing with each passing day. Despite the sheer brutality of the murders, there were no immediate clues as to the identity of the killer. The footprints in the snow, which had originally led Andreas Gruber to suspect someone had been lurking around the house, provided little evidence. No weapon was found, and there were no witnesses to testify as to what had happened. What followed was one of the most frustrating and confounding investigations in the history of German criminal law. The authorities had no leads to follow. Suspicion fell on several possible suspects, including a former farmhand, who had been dismissed from the farm years before. However, no one could be definitively connected to the murders. As the months passed, the case grew colder. Theories emerged, ranging from the possibility of a stranger with a grudge against the family to the idea that the murders had been committed by someone from within the Gruber household. Some suggested that Victoria's relationship with her father, which had been rumored to be inappropriate, had led to a motive for murder. Yet, despite numerous investigations, no conclusive answers were ever found. The chilling legacy of the Hinterkaifeck murders continues to haunt the small town of Weingarten, where the farm once stood. In the decades that followed, the property was abandoned and ultimately demolished, yet the legend of the murders remains. The strange and inexplicable events that led to the deaths of 6 innocent people, the killer who seemed to disappear without a trace, and the unrelenting atmosphere of terror that plagued the farm continue to captivate and unsettle those who learn of it. The horror of the Hinterkaifeck murders lingers in the collective memory of those who remember the chilling events. Despite the passage of time, the eerie silence that hung over the farm and the unsettling mystery of what really happened that night still cast a long, horrifying shadow over the landscape. And so the question remains: who killed the Gruber family? Was it someone who had been living among them? Or was there something more terrifying lurking in the depths of that isolated farm, a presence that would never be fully understood? The true story of Hinterkaifeck remains one of the darkest and most perplexing mysteries in history, an unsolved riddle that still beckons those who dare to search for the truth, even if that truth may never be found. The Villisca Axe Murders, A Sleepy Town's Bloody Nightmare, 1912. In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, there was an eerie stillness that enveloped the air on the evening of June 9, 1912. It was the sort of small town where everyone knew each other, where doors were rarely locked, and the only sounds heard at night were the chirping of crickets and the soft hum of farm life. But on that night, the hum would be replaced with something far more sinister, a violent, unrelenting sound that would forever change the town's history. The Moore family, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, were well known in the town, respected by their neighbors. That evening they had been joined by 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, the daughters of a neighboring family. It had been a peaceful evening. The children had attended a church service earlier in the day, and afterward they spent time visiting friends before heading back home for the night. The house they returned to was a modest one, a 2-story home on a quiet street. The Moore family had always felt safe here, but as the children climbed into their beds and the night began to settle in, a malevolent presence was already making its way toward them. No one could have known that something wicked lurked in the shadows, something that would invade their home and forever stain the town with a blood-red horror. That night around midnight, the first blow was struck. The killer, whose identity remains a mystery to this day, used an axe, a simple tool, one that would become the instrument of unspeakable violence. The killer crept through the house, starting with Josiah Moore, the father. In the stillness of the night, the axe fell swiftly, and Josiah was struck in the head with a violent force that left him dead in his bed. The killer then moved to Sarah Moore, his wife, whose fate was sealed in the same chilling manner. What followed was a brutal massacre. The killer made his way from room to room methodically and without mercy. Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, the Moore children, were slaughtered in their beds, each of them struck down while they slept, helpless and unaware of the horror that had come to claim their lives. But the terror didn't stop there. The 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who had been invited into the Moore home for the night, were also victims of the same brutal fate. The killer moved between the rooms, ensuring that no one would survive to tell the tale. The murders were executed with horrifying precision, and the weapon used, the axe, was left next to the bodies, a grisly signature of the killer's dark work. When the sun rose the following morning, the town of Villisca was thrust into a nightmare. A neighbor, concerned that she had not seen the Moore family out and about as usual, went to the house to check on them. What she found sent her into a state of shock. The house was eerily quiet, and the bodies of the Moore family and their guests lay lifeless in their beds, their faces frozen in terror. The police were quickly called, and an investigation was launched, but the crime scene was unlike anything the authorities had encountered before. The killer had left no obvious signs of a struggle, and there were no signs of forced entry. In fact, the doors to the house had been locked from the inside. It was as if the killer had known exactly what he was doing, as if he had walked freely through the home with complete knowledge of where each person was. What was even more disturbing was the evidence that suggested the killer had stayed in the house after the murders. The axe, still bloodied, had been placed in a position of casual indifference, almost as if the killer had taken a moment to rest before fleeing. In fact, the killer's presence lingered in the house for hours after the murders, as though he had taken his time, almost savoring the aftermath of his brutal work. There were no immediate suspects, and the case quickly became one of the most mysterious and chilling crimes in American history. Theories abounded, ranging from the possibility of a random stranger committing the crime to the idea that someone within the town had been responsible. The people of Villisca, once known for their friendly, small-town atmosphere, found themselves torn apart by fear and suspicion. The townspeople could no longer trust their neighbors, and every shadow became suspect. The axe-wielding killer had struck at the heart of their community, leaving nothing but fear in his wake. But the investigation turned up no definitive answers. Dozens of people were questioned, but none could be connected to the murders. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled about potential suspects, but each theory collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence. Some even believed that the killer might have been someone passing through town, a drifter who had no real connection to the community. But the fact that the killer had known the house so well and had struck with such precision suggested that it was someone who had been familiar with the Moore family. Theories ran wild. One of the most persistent theories was that a man named Reverend George Kelly, who had visited Villisca on the night of the murders, might have been involved. Kelly had a history of mental instability, and he had been seen near the Moore home on the night of the killings. However, despite multiple interrogations and investigations, no solid evidence ever linked him to the crime, and he was never formally charged. In the years that followed, the case slowly began to fade from public consciousness, though the horror of the Villisca axe murders lingered like a dark cloud over the town. The house where the murders took place stood abandoned for years, a decaying monument to the violence that had been wrought within its walls. Eventually, the house was sold, and though it became a site of macabre fascination for true crime enthusiasts, the mystery of who killed the Moore family and their guests remained unsolved. Even today, nearly a century after the murders, the case continues to haunt the town of Villisca. Visitors still flock to the old house, hoping to uncover clues that will reveal the identity of the killer, though the answers seem as elusive as ever. Some claim that the house is haunted by the spirits of the victims, their restless souls trapped in the place where their lives were stolen away. Others believe that the killer's identity is lost forever, a dark secret buried beneath the floorboards of history. The Villisca axe murders remain one of the most chilling and unsolved crimes in American history. It's a case that has captivated generations, and the unanswered questions only add to the sinister allure of the story. Who killed the Moore family, and why? Was it a stranger with a thirst for blood, or was it someone they knew? The truth remains as elusive as the murderer himself, a mystery that continues to stir the darkness in the hearts of those who dare to look into the nightmarish history of Villisca, Iowa.